Good evening. My name is Margery Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. I'm delighted that you could join us this evening for the January reading in our virtual series Readings from the Room. This series began in March 2021, and for anyone new to us, the Writers' Room of Boston is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, whether you're established or emerging, anyone who wants or needs a quiet place to write. The room is open 24 hours a day, and it provides desks and silence and the quiet companionship of other writers. We've been serving the writers of Greater Boston since 1993, and during and since the pandemic, the room has been offering online resources as well, including this reading series and an online writing group with prompts, and discussions. On January 31st, next week, we're inaugurating a series of interviews with guests knowledgeable about, for example, getting your work to a publisher, agents, and guidance for online publishing. So please contact us if you're curious or have any questions about the room and its programs, and check out our Facebook and Instagram posts at Writers of Boston. Our website has photos and announcements, and that's where you can find recordings of past readings from the room and more information. We would be delighted to have new members. We have different levels of membership, including a virtual membership for those who can't easily make it downtown to the room. So if you're interested, please check out our website. In 2021, we launched this new reading series as a way to reach out to the writing community during the pandemic and share wonderful writing from both established and emerging writers. We've been lucky enough to have writers from different backgrounds and representing a range of genres. Some of the readers call or have called the Writers' Room home, and some are from different parts of the country, thanks to Zoom. This series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council and the Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. So if you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution by going to the website and clicking the donate button. Also, we will be recording this reading, and a replay will be available on the website. Tonight, we have two fiction writers who also write creative nonfiction from Maine, Kate Kennedy and Agnes Bushell. As we go along this evening, feel free to use the question and answer feature in the box at the bottom of the screen, where you can type in your questions, because we will have time for discussion at the end. Our first reader is Agnes Bushell. Agnes is a writer and editor. She's the author of 14 novels, and her reviews and essays have appeared in numerous newspapers and journals, mostly in the state of Maine, where she lives. She's Associate Professor Emerita in Liberal Arts at Maine College of Art and Design, where she taught writing and literature for many years, and she is the recipient of 2 Maine Literary Awards, including one for Distinguished Achievement. She's described by book critic Dana Wilde as one of Maine's largely unsung master fiction writers. Her novels chronicle the myriad changes that have occurred in American society over the course of the past 4 decades, from the trial of radical leftists in Local Deities from 1990 to the search for spiritual enlightenment in the Oracle Pool from 2020. Her latest novel, Monkey, is the story of a dangerous book which may hold the secret to time travel, set in mid-19th century Russia. Bushell lives in Portland with her husband, James. Their small press, Literal Books, established in 2018, publishes the work of writers and artists from Maine and New England. And you can get her novel, Monkey, and also Kate Kennedy's work through the Literal Press. And we will post that website in the chat at the bottom of the page. Tonight, Agnes will read from her most recent novel, Monkey. Agnes, you can take it away.
Hello there, and thank you so much for coming. I'm going to start reading from chapter 1 of Monkey. The chapter is called The Missing Son. Early one summer morning, just as the sun was rising over the hills, Vasily Yakovlevich Barakov, dressed in his gardening clothes, straw hat on his head, cane in his hand, was strolling through his flower garden. The air was cool and fragrant. Drops of dew lay scattered on the grass like tiny diamonds. Birds greeted the dawn from the treetops. Nothing was amiss in the world. But Vasily Yakovlevich had been unable to sleep. He had been haunted all night by his usual worries. And so he had risen and dressed and gone to visit his roses in the hope that beauty might dispel care. So far, it had not. He paused in front of Rosa pestana, a perfect flower, now in full bloom. One could become fanatical about flowers as one could about anything, acquisitive, competitive, greedy. Still, he thought, gardening itself, the actual work of gardening, was a humbling experience, got you onto your knees in the dirt. And then once you lifted your eyes from the ground and looked around, and he did lift his eyes and look, there was work to be done everywhere. The bathhouse needed a new roof. The pond was being encroached upon by willows. The path to the hill was becoming overgrown. The wood was steadily creeping up to the old labyrinth whose hedges needed cutting. The fountain was dry and clogged with dead leaves. And just beyond the cultivated flower garden, wilderness reigned amidst the lilacs and rhododendrons, the hazel, elder, and honeysuckle. His heart yearned for the wilderness to take over everything. Yes, take everything, the fields, the village, the entire estate, for what men imposed on nature was unnatural, barbarous, rooted in human misery, and a blight on the face of the earth. If his son did not return, if he maintained his silence, if he refused the land as it seemed he would, in fact, as he already had, and a memory came back to him then, as memory so often did now. It had happened one summer morning 30 odd years ago. His father was still alive. They were visiting his estate, and Nikolai, little Kolya, 4 or 5 years old at the time, by an unfortunate lapse of attention on someone's part, had been playing near the stables on a day designated for punishment, and had run into the stables at the very moment a serf was being flogged, probably for good reason, Vasily always believed, since his father had not been a cruel or unjust man. Still, there was the poor soul tied prostrate on the ground. There was the bailiff leaning over him with a whip. And just then Kolya came running in. They had found it funny what the child did. Even the bailiff himself had laughed at it. And the story was told for years, how the master's grandson, little Kolya, had run right up to the bailiff and to stop his blow from falling on the miscreant's back, had grabbed the bailiff by the beard and pulled at it. Yes, everyone had thought it amusing. But Kolya had not found it funny at all. He pulled the bailiff's beard and then burst into tears, and they had to comfort him and carry him back to the house. But why tears? Vasily Yakovlevich had always wondered about it. Now, for some reason, it was a question that haunted him. Why tears? For whom was his son crying? For the man being flogged? For the bailiff whose beard he had pulled? Or were the tears for the loss of his own innocence, for the grief that had come to his soul, seeing what he had just seen, the obscenity of one man beating another? Vasily wished with all his heart that he had asked his son that question. So then he thought, stopping in front of his Rosa Damascena, using his cane to dig out a small weed growing near its roots. If Nikolai did not want the land, he would give it to his serfs. That's what he would do. He would give them the land. Isn't that what they wanted? Isn't that what he wanted for them? Land and freedom. Isn't that what the young advocated? So he would do it. He would give them the land, the house along with it, the roses, everything. Yes, if Nikolai did not come home, did not ever come home, and if Anastasia approved, which he knew she would, he would free his serfs and give them the land. Before he died, he would do it, finally. They could move to Odessa and spend their last years by the sea. Having dug out one small weed, he noticed others. What else could he do? If his son returned, that was different. But he'd had that nightmare again. It was a dream that had awakened him, and after that, there was no sleeping for the rest of the night. He was looking out across a vast plain of sand at a line of blue, which he knew was the sea, but a sea that had ebbed away, leaving a desert behind. He began to run toward it, over the sand, over shells and stones, running toward the still ebbing sea, until he realized that if the tide turned and the sea rushed back, he was so far from the shore that the sea would drown him. Then he heard a roar, the roar of surf, and he looked out and saw coming toward him at great speed an enormous wall of water. The dream was simple and obvious. Yet while he was dreaming it, each time it held the same power. It filled him with the same terror. Probably all over Russia, men were dreaming the same dream. The sea could only ebb for so long. Eventually, the tide would turn, and those who were standing there gaping would be drowned in the flood. Perhaps his son was smart to stay away, to find another life. There were many ways of living, as many ways of living as there were people alive. The trick was to find a way to live that didn't murder your soul. If his son had managed to do that, then he could be proud of him once he stopped being angry at him. He had stayed away too long, and for what? Why this long absence, this silence? He didn't have to visit them, but how hard was it to write a letter? Having paused in his thinking at that point, the point to which he always came whenever he thought of his son, he heard the glorious sunrise symphony of bird song and then other sounds from the stables, the barns, the house, as though he stood in the center of the world and everything was awakening around him. He glanced up at his wife's windows. Was she awake as well? Perhaps today she would come down, for Irina and the children were arriving that afternoon. She was being foolish staying up in her rooms. But the children reminded her of Kolya when he was small and made her miss him more. She had told them that, how the children, the little boys especially, only made her miss him more. He slapped the dirt with his cane and thought it was about time he got to work. Coffee first, then the accounts. And then I'm going to read a very small section that takes place in Odessa, because part of the book takes place in Odessa, and in honor of Ukraine, I thought I would read this small piece. Odessa is pleasant in winter, but it is paradise in spring, which comes early and lusciously to the south, fragrant, warm, delicious, and decorated with sweet flowers like an exquisite French pastry. Petersburg might be frozen solid under drifts of snow, but we sat outside at the cafes under umbrellas meant to shield us not from sleet, but from sunlight. Oh, the sunlight on the sea, sparkling, ever-changing, mercurial. The ancient Greeks did not call the sea either green or blue or gray, but rather described it in terms of light, how light struck it, its absence darkening it like wine, its presence making it sparkle and glimmer. Pavel Damianich informed me of this fact, having heard it from a classical scholar or a Greek sailor, and it seemed not only reasonable but right, the right result of clear sight, for I spent many hours watching light play on the sea from the height of Primorsky Boulevard, that long tree-shaded avenue that ran along the cliff top overlooking the port. I had become lethargic and complacent here, or perhaps I had simply allowed Odessa to work its spell on me. This beautiful city that felt not at all like a Russian city, but far more like an Italian one, a city filled with people from many lands, speaking many languages, a city that felt free. Yes, that was it, of course. It was as though Odessa was its own city-state in which different rules applied, or a city that belonged to another country, in which people could speak their minds without fear. It was the absence of fear that was the city's greatest gift to her citizens. How long could it last?
Sure. Okay. Oops, am I back? Sorry, there I am. Thank you, Agnes. That was wonderful. And I would love to read that whole book actually now. Our next reader is Kate Kennedy. And Kate is a writer, an editor, and a teacher. And her most recent book, Skin, a memoir, it details her experiences with facial melanoma. It was a finalist in the 2021 Maine Literary Awards for Memoir. She's published a novel, End Over End, 2 editions of short biographies, Maine's Remarkable Women, and numerous short fiction and nonfiction pieces in literary magazines. Skin, a memoir, reviewer Tobias Carroll writes, from Kennedy's choice of words to the distinctive portraits of people she met during a time of crisis in her life, there is not a wasted word, and the results make for an intimate, visceral, and moving work of nonfiction. Kate earned a BA from Wellesley College and an MA from UCLA. She's taught writing to high schoolers as well as to graduate students at the University of Maine. She was also director of the Southern Maine Writing Project at the University of Southern Maine. She lives with her husband, Nate Green, in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. You can also get Kate's book, as I said, from the Literal Press, whose website is pasted into the chat. And now, Kate.
Thank you, Margery, very much. And Agnes, thank you. It's so wonderful to hear you read. We decided, maybe because it's January in Maine, that we would read things related to garden. So that's the connecting strand. This is from new work of mine. It's not finished. It's in process. And I think it's going to be called Jacaranda Time. This is set in the early part of the 1950s in Southern California. And there's one vocabulary word that maybe you're not familiar with, which is dichondra, which is was back then, I don't know now, a common popular ground cover instead of grass. Jacaranda Time. When I think now of the sacred, it lives in the yard behind my earliest childhood home. White stucco with an orange tile roof. The sacred dwelled in the jacaranda tree and in copa de oro flowers, real gold that felt so much like fleshy human skin that later, when I learned the myth of King Midas, I recognized the terrain. But in my land, copa de oro petals made no mischief. I was the hand-sized trumpets that swayed over the back stockade fence, and Mrs. Mack's sweet peas bobbing over the side fence between her yard and ours. I was those two. Who can ever find those colors again in such profusion? Armfuls of old-fashioned smells blooming forever and ever in that jacaranda time. And I was the fermenting persimmons plopped down on the garage side of the backyard. They gurgled and buzzed with yellow jackets until Mac Macamura, the gardener, scooped them into a bucket. He was no relation to Mrs. Mack next door, Mrs. McEachran, whose husband worked for Mr. Disney. The Macks were short and white. Actually, she was round and pink, very pink. Mac, the gardener, was Japanese and talked to my best friend, Gracie, and me. Most days, he was the only grown-up in my yard or Gracie's or Mr. and Mrs. Mack's. Will, who lived across the street, tended his own azaleas and tuberous begonias, though Mac still mowed his dichondra. Will and Doris didn't go by Mr. and Mrs. the way the Macks did, or the Burns Moors 2 doors up behind a prickly hedge. It felt like one long jacaranda time when I was 4 and 6 and 8. The tree itself kept time, like the beat of a song in circles and cycles, but not the clear, strict seasons of back east. Around Christmas, the leaves on the jacaranda, more like ferns than leaves, curled up and fell off. Not much later, new leaves appeared, soft and blushy green as the Chinese tree fern. And then my tree flowered, full burst milky purple blossoms that turned into round pods, hard as castanets and just as clackety. But I've hurried up the telling too much, made it speed by too quickly, that progression of jacaranda time, an insistent drum beating rhythm. In fact, in life, it spun, slow and delicious, not noticeable from one day to another, except that kindergarten began and first grade and ended and first grade and second grade and third. In kindergarten, we grew radishes in boxes on the playground, and we took a field trip to a vacant lot 2 blocks down Montana Avenue to visit the trapdoor spider who lived there in a hole in the dirt and made a round door out of mud and weeds and silk. If danger lurked, it pulled its hinged door over the hole and lived off its stockpile of dead bugs. It was like a bomb shelter filled with enough of everything it needed until the all-clear whistle blew. Then it lifted its door, pushed it aside, and peeked out. Much later, bulldozers plowed the lot to dusty bits, and apartment houses went up. That happened long after Jacaranda time, though, when life moved too fast or too slow, depending, and we'd already moved back east. I'm gonna have a little water. The next short section is called Ouija Kid. But this gauzy reverential devotion to Jacaranda time holds up only one side of the story. Still, it does hold, and I've clasped it tightly in the aftermath of all that happened so many years later. And dwelling first on those early days gives me the illusion of a safe platform from which to leap. In truth, I was not a sacred focused child. The presence of gore on my block, any catastrophe from a skinned knee to a car accident held me in its thrall. Microcosm pain, microcosm drama, but real nonetheless. My senses swarmed like predator fish in the wake of blood. I wanted nothing more than to watch and to tell. When in my early teens, I saw an exhibit of black and white photographs taken by the New York freelance photographer Ouija, I believed I'd found a kindred spirit. He seemed to go for the lurid, just as I did. He was nicknamed Ouija after Ouija boards because he'd show up with his camera at crime scenes and disasters, sometimes even before the police arrived. The police, I learned later, had given him a scanner to which he paid close attention, especially late at night. But still, he had a sixth sense. On 25th Street, dramatic events usually unfolded in the front yard or down the block. But once our backyard hosted mayhem when my dad and Will went deep sea fishing together off San Pedro and brought back an albacore. Other times they traded their catch for cans of tuna, but this once the whole fish lay on the picnic table before they butchered it. While I kept guard, they disappeared inside to sharpen their knives. Satan the cat and I kept guard. I stared at the fish. Though it was dead, its eye was open, a yellow ring, a brown ring. It didn't blink, but Satan did, and so did I. It, the fish, lay on its side facing Mrs. Mack's sweet peas. The top of its back was deep ocean blue, and fins hugged its side. They shone silver in that gold place under the jacaranda. Gracie's mother said if a jacaranda flower landed on your head, it was good luck. So I picked a limp, milky purple bell up off the ground and placed it on the fish's top fin. Nothing changed. Satan jumped on the picnic table, lifting his chin and whiskers. The fish stank, but to Satan it must have smelled the way milk duds and sweet peas did to me, and he jumped on the table to lick the fish's scales. After sniffing some more, he stepped closer to the fish's eye. Still, it didn't blink. Satan's paw touched its mouth, opened a little with sharp teeth. He licked its open eye, and then Satan's own teeth began to gnaw. The tuna still wouldn't blink, and its luck never changed. The cat licked and gnawed until goo dripped out, and I just watched, not blinking either. I didn't wonder then, but I wonder now how a girl of 4 or 6 or 8 could have witnessed the chewing of an eyeball and not helped the fish, or at least run inside to tell her dad. But I was a watching Ouija kid, and the fish's mouth was already cut jagged from the hook. And I'll read one last section called Dents. And in this scene, her older brother is riding a flexi, which is like it's short for flexible flyer, which was a kind of a sled, except in Southern California, it had wheels instead of runners. So inside the meander of jacaranda time, there was also room for speed. My older brother Stuart and his friends hopped on their flexis and streaked down the sidewalk hill from Margarita to Alta, where they braked or took the corner on 2 wheels. For Gracie and me, speed was sitting on a tin pie plate balanced on a roller skate. We hurtled along as far as Mrs. Mack's lawn, halfway down the hill. Throw up scorched our throats at the risk, We screeched for joy. There at the edge of control, Gracie slipped onto her bottom, but I veered off the sidewalk and braked on Mrs. Mack's dichondra, leaving 2 front wheel-sized dents, and it had happened before. Mr. Mack built ship models that sailed across movie screens as if truly rounding Cape Horn, except in huge tanks of water. Waves pounded, wind rattled the rigging, and sometimes ships capsized. But Mr. Mack yanked them out, and with a few screws and some varnish, they carried on. Usually, when he got home from work, there was never a peep. But that night, Mrs. Mack loudly shooed him out like an unwelcome rooster to complain to my mother about the likes of me putting dents in her dichondra. Mother listened tight-lipped and apologized. After he left, though, she muttered something about the Macks running their sprinklers so often the damn lawn turned to mush, and of course it would dent. But I wasn't to break there anymore. Did I understand? I did. And I was further made to understand, darkly, that dichondra was a precious substitute for the children they couldn't have. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Unmute myself, and thank you so much, both of you, for reading. And we do have just have a quick question first for Kate. Is that part of a work that's finished, or are you still in progress?
Well, I've written a whole bunch of small scenes, snippets, that ranging from the early 1950s until relatively recently, but they haven't been stitched together. And for me, they're connected, but I haven't quite figured out exactly how they're connected, which as a writer, for me, is kind of the most interesting thing, although frustrating.
Interesting, because I can hear some connections, but first I'm going to shift over because we had a question right away for Agnes, which is, and you can come back if you'd like. Yeah, is what kind of research did you do for your fiction?
For this book, I did a lot. Yeah, I did quite a lot of research. I started by reading Russian, because one of the first person narrator in the book, which you heard a little bit of in the Odessa section, is based on a Russian writer named Marko Vovchek. And so I learned about her by reading Russian women poets of the 19th century, because I knew that one of my characters was going to be a poet. And I read about them, and I read Alexander Herzen's autobiography, and one thing led to another. I read about Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, because she is also a character in the book, and books about 19th century Russian revolutionary history. So I spent a lot of time reading, a lot.
And the second question for both of you is, does either of you garden?
I do not.
I do.
You do.
Yes, I love to garden. I'm not, my hand isn't in it as much as I might like, but I just love it. I love plants very much.
And I'll ask sort of, I think we don't have another from the audience, but I will ask another one of you, Kate, which is, because I'm intrigued by what you're putting together. So would you call this a work of fiction or creative nonfiction, or don't you know yet?
Well, I think I'd call it autobiographical fiction. Usually writers start their writing their autobiographical novel, and I think I'm kind of winding down with mine, maybe. But it's clearly a novel, and there's clearly a lot of autobiography in it. So it's a mélange, if you could say that.
Yeah. Okay. Because I was just interested in the protagonist, who is such an observer. both you talk about her connection to Ouija and also just as you described things. And I was wondering if that was your experience, you know, observing, for instance, the spider and then the cat licking the fish's eyeball. I have to say, my cat jumped on the table.
Sorry, everybody.
No, my cat jumped on the table at that point. I think she's very.
Finally, someone's writing about a cat.
But were they things that you, I mean, are you including things you both imagine, things that you remember, or is this again?
Actually, those, the bits that I read were things that I remembered and embellished as well, which is a lot of what fiction can be. So.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. So we're at 7:30. Does either of you have a question for the other person at this point? I know you know each other, so you may have answered all.
I know all our answers.
Okay. Then thank you so much. And I will say to the audience, I have a few things just to wrap up with, but I will also say to the audience that this involved a lot of technological excitement and
One way of putting it.
Perseverance. And I just really want to appreciate and thank everybody, all of the writers and everybody tech and who helped us put this together because it was a challenge at times, and here we are. So I want to thank you, Kate and Agnes, for the readings, and to everybody who joined us. And a special thanks to Leslie Ostro, who is our indomitable program director, who was our indomitable producer and technology maven tonight. So in February, we are changing the night. We've been on Wednesdays. We're going to be changing the readings from the room to Tuesdays. So we will start on the third Tuesday of the month, which is February 21st. And please join us. We will have a young local writer, Hannah Hasuris, and the author Lindsay Schaefer, who writes inspired by art and myth. And please join us this upcoming Tuesday, January 31st, for the first interview in our series. It will take place with Lucas Talent. And Lucas has been a member of the room. He also read for this series, and he will talk about some of his own work and also about some of the nuts and bolts of publishing online. The announcement for the readings, the interviews, and any other Writers' Room news can be found on the website, Instagram, and Facebook, and we look forward to you joining us. So good night, everybody, and thank you again, readers and listeners alike.
Thank you, Margery, and thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.